Wonderful story of love. Tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love. Wake the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it. Shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love. 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 Though you are far away, wonderful story of love. Still he doth call today, calling from Calvary's mountain, down from the crystal bright fountain, e'en from the dawn of creation. Wonderful story of love. 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 Jesus provides a rest. Wonderful story of love. For all the pure and blessed, rest in those mansions above us, with those who've gone on before us, singing the rapturous chorus. Wonderful story of love. 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 Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be, when we all see Jesus.
Lovely sound we hadn't heard in a while, so I'm glad for the rain. 1 Samuel chapter 12. If you'll turn to 1 Samuel chapter 12. This was from the 20th of August on the reading schedule. And we want to observe just a few things from this chapter. We're going to start off actually by reading a somewhat lengthy section starting in verse 6 and reading through verse 18. That's going to be kind of foundational to our discussion. It says that Samuel said to the people, "The Lord is witness, who appointed Moses and Aaron and brought your fathers up out of the land of Egypt. Now therefore stand still, that I may plead with you before the Lord concerning all the righteous deeds of the Lord that he performed for you and for your fathers. When Jacob went to Egypt, and the Egyptians oppressed them, then your fathers cried out to the Lord, and the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your fathers out of Egypt and made them dwell in this place. But they forgot the Lord their God, and he sold them into the hands of Sisera, commander of the army of Hazor, and into the hand of the Philistines, and into the hand of Moab, and they fought against them. And they cried out to the Lord and said, We have sinned because we have forsaken the Lord and have served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. But now deliver us out of the hand of our enemies, that we may serve you. And the Lord sent Jerubbaal and Barak and Jephthah and Samuel, and delivered you out of the hand of your enemies on every side. And you lived in safety. And when you saw that Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, came against you, you said to me, No, but a king shall reign over us, when the Lord your God was your king. And now behold, the king whom you have chosen, for whom you have asked, behold, the Lord has set a king over you. If you will fear the Lord and serve him and obey his voice and not rebel against the Lord, and not rebel against the commandment of the Lord. And if both you and the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God, it will be well. But if you will not obey the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you and your king. Now therefore stand still and see this great thing that the Lord will do before your eyes. Is it not wheat harvest today? I will call upon the Lord that he may send thunder and rain, and you shall know and see that your wickedness is great, which you have done in the sight of the Lord in asking for yourselves a king. So Samuel called upon the Lord, and the Lord sent thunder and rain that day, and all the people greatly feared the Lord and Samuel. And so what we have here is a record of Samuel, who is pleading with the people of God. Samuel is a prophet. He's also the last of the judges. And he is just pleading with the people of God. And so he recounts some of the good things that God has done. He reminds them of their history. He reminds them of the descendants of Jacob going into Egypt and ended up in slavery for 400 years, and God bringing them out and bringing them into the land that they were now living in. And there's been many generations past since those things, but he's reminding them. And I think to some degree, this is also to remind them about this covenant relationship that they were in because of these things. But ultimately, they reject God, and they're punished, and they seek deliverance, and God sends a judge, and they reject God, and they cry to God for deliverance, and God sends a judge, and they're delivered, and then it happens again. And that's captured in the list of different enemies here and the list of different judges. And that's not all of them, but the short list stands for the whole. And he's just reminding them of their time over the last number of years that this has been going on. And then this final enemy comes against them, and they immediately start crying for a king. Now, the implication is made pretty clear that what they think is that having a earthly king is somehow going to position them better to defend themselves against these enemies instead of relying upon God. And so they have rejected God yet again. But God goes ahead and acquiesces to their request and grants that they might have an earthly king. And then he warns them. He warns them that both they and the king need to listen to him and obey him, or else he is not going to protect them. Now, all of this message was authenticated as a message from God by a storm in the middle of the wheat harvest, which would have been a very destructive thing. This is a bad time for the rains to come. It was a time when there wouldn't normally have been rain, and it's something that would not have been favorable for them, and it probably cost them greatly in their harvest. And so it says that they feared the Lord and they feared Samuel, because Samuel is the one who had asked God to do this thing, and God did it. And then in the verses that come right after this section, there is a series of 5 key behaviors that are required for God to deliver and keep and protect them. And they come, like I said, in the next verses, starting in verse 20 is where we're going to begin with the first one, which is do not fear. That's where it starts. That's where all of their problems came from, was fear. Verse 20 says that Samuel said to the people, do not be afraid. You have done all this evil, yet do not turn aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. And what he's saying to the people and what is being said to us, it's the reason this is recorded and preserved for our reading and knowledge, is that we need to make certain to not let fear, and in this case, particularly the fear of potential judgment, to cause us to run and hide from God. And that's often what people do. We know we've made a mistake, And instead of owning that mistake and dealing with the consequences of what we've done, we try to hide it. And it happens in homes with children. It happens in the workplace with grown people. It happens in school settings. It happens just about anywhere that people are. And he's telling them, don't make that mistake. Now, it manifests itself in other ways too. Sometimes we just fear a situation. And we think that we need to turn to someone for help. Now, God has been over them, and God has been leading them, and God has been delivering them for all of these years. But they continually are turning to other folks looking for help instead of turning to God. In fact, on 3 occasions, 3 separate occasions, these people who had once been in bondage to Egypt, who were delivered out of bondage to Egypt, and who, when Moses gave the law, we're told in Deuteronomy's account of the giving of the law, that God told them, don't turn back to Egypt. Don't turn back there to multiply your horses and your chariots. In other words, don't rely upon Egypt and their army to deliver you. Don't go. I just got you out of there. Don't go back there looking for help. And yet they did it 3 times in their history. Made alliances with Egypt, looking for help and deliverance from their enemies, instead of trusting God. God had destroyed the Egyptian army that was pursuing them. God didn't need anybody's help. And they didn't need to be afraid, because God had said, I'm with you. And yet here they were doing these things. And this is a warning. Don't be afraid. Yes, you've done this evil stuff, but don't turn aside from following the Lord out of fear. Serve the Lord with all your heart. In other words, rather than try to respond to your evil with more evil. You know, all of our mamas told us that a long time ago. 2 wrongs don't make it right. That's essentially what the prophet is saying here. Rather than do that, turn to God. Try to work harder to make yourself wholeheartedly serve God, who has told you that he is there, who has told you that he will deliver you, who has told you that you can trust him, and who has demonstrated repeatedly that you can trust him. Every time you've done evil and you've fallen into bad circumstances, it is God who has come to your rescue. Don't be afraid and turn aside from following the Lord. Fear is actually a problem. Fear can cause us to turn aside from following the Lord. And so there's key number 1. Don't let fear get in the way of your service to God. Secondly, in verse 21, and he says, do not turn aside after empty things that cannot profit or deliver, for they are empty. Don't turn to empty worldly things to look for help, to look for comfort. Don't put any confidence in these things, because they're vain. They're empty. They're like the wind. There's no long-lasting presence or effect of them. They're like a vapor that appears and vanishes. There's a lot of different metaphors I guess we could use. But these kinds of empty things I think that he has in mind are cataloged by the writer of Ecclesiastes. When the writer of Ecclesiastes puts his mind to discover wisdom and understand what life is about, you go through a man who pursued drink, who pursued just material pleasure, just wealth and money and things, who pursued material work, and the product of that work is something to be satisfied with, who pursued human wisdom and philosophy, and then collected for himself singers and concubines for physical pleasure and for aesthetic enjoyment. Everything that this world offers, he explored And over again, the refrain comes, vanity of vanity, all is vanity. Vain things. He says, don't turn to vain things. Don't get caught by the shiny things of the world, because that does not help you. Thirdly, look at verse 22. For the Lord will not forsake his people, for his great name's sake. Now that is set apart with commas in my translation. What that's saying is it's kind of a parenthetical note. The sentence is, for the Lord will not forsake his people because it has pleased the Lord to make you a people for himself. With a parenthetical note, for his great name's sake. It's not because we're so wonderful, it's because of him. He's not going to forsake us because of him and because of the promises that he has made. We have to remember that God is not going to forsake us. If we remember that God is not going to forsake us, then not being afraid becomes easier. And not allowing the empty things of life to get in between us and God becomes easier. Because I'm aware of the presence and the protection and the providence of God. God doesn't forsake his people. He's never forsaken his people. He never will forsake his people. God forsakes people who forsake him. Romans chapter 1 talks about the Gentiles who just went further and further and further away from God, who gave up God, and it says God gave them up. He gave them up when they had no interest, when they had no willingness to pursue, when they had no willingness to listen, when they began to replace the knowledge of God with their own knowledge and profess themselves to be wise, when they were, in fact, as the Roman writer would say, they were fools. We mentioned this morning that the psalmist tells us who the fool is. The fool is one who says in their heart, there is no God. So when people get to the point that they look to their lives and their world and themselves and the things that this world has to offer, and those things replace God, well, God ceases to pursue. He gives them up. But he never is the forsaker. He never is the one who departs and goes away. The Lord will not forsake his people. We can forsake God. He'll never forsake us. Fourthly, if you look in verse 23, we learned something extremely significant. Moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for you, and I will instruct you in the good thing, in the good and the right way. We're going to make an assumption here that since how Samuel was a prophet, since how Samuel was a judge, since how Samuel was being moved by God to tell them these things, and since how Samuel, when we get to the end of that story, called upon God to bring this rain, and the rain came, his prayers were being listened to and responded to by God, and the sign was provided to generate the fear that it did in the people for Samuel. That Samuel was a righteous man, that Samuel was doing the right thing, that Samuel's heart was where it needed to be, that he was pursuing God. And what he says, therefore, is that he recognizes that he has two particular obligations. He says, I will not cease praying for you. The righteous have an obligation to pray for those who have gone astray. And what this verse says is very significant, because he says, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for you. If we don't do it, that is a sin that we are committing. It's what we would classify as a sin of omission, an obligation that we have that we fail to meet. We omit an obligation. So that's the first obligation, to pray for those in sin. to be aware of them, not to hate them, not to despise them, not to wish them ill, but to desire what is good for them and to seek and beseech the Lord on their behalf. I'm not real sure that we do that as much as we ought to. And this doesn't just apply to praying for those in our family who have sinned, or praying for our friends who have sinned. This is praying for the world who is in sin and departed from God. That they may have the opportunity, that they may be granted through God's providence. The connection with someone who can exemplify what is righteous, who can teach what is righteous, who can lead them back to God, who can help them and snatch them out of the destruction that is certainly theirs, that happens to all people who depart from God. We need to, right there with God, desire that no one is lost. As for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for you. And then the second obligation, and I will instruct you in the good and the right way. Instruct them with the truth from God. We have to continue to pray for folks, and we have to share the gospel with folks. To not do so is sin. And that sin isn't any less sin than the sins that others are committing. It's not somehow less of a sin to refuse to pray and to teach than it is to fear and allow that fear to draw you away from God, or than it is to pursue the empty things of the world. We look at people out there pursuing the empty things of the world and we kind of shake our heads, and they're not doing anything worse than what we are doing when we forsake our obligations to them. That's what this point in key number 4 is. And then the fifth key is found in the 24th verse. Only fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart. For consider what great things he has done for you. The solution is to fear God, to serve him faithfully, to serve him completely, not with a little bit of your heart, not with a little bit of your time, not with a little bit, but with all of your wholehearted devotion. Serve him faithfully with all of your heart, not every once in a while, not wholehearted devotion this week and then a lack of devotion for a week or two and then wholehearted devotion again. And serve him faithfully with your whole heart. And then he gives us a reason for consider what great things he has done for you. You remember the passage we started with? I told you it was a foundational passage. One of the things that Samuel did was rehearse some of the things that God had done for them. He brought you out of Egypt. He brought you into this land. He gave you this land as a home. When you turned from him and your enemies came against you and warred with you and you got in trouble and you cried out to him, he sent you a deliverer and he brought you back. And even though you did it repeatedly, he continued to deliver you over and over and over again. And now, even though you've done this great evil and you've requested a king rather than trust in God, he's still going to help you. He's still going to deliver you. Remember the great things he has done for you. Listen, with all of those things, that sounds quite wonderful. He did nothing in any of those things that compares with what he did for man in his Son. When through his love for mankind and his desire to deliver mankind from the consequences of sin, he sent Jesus into the world to die, so that through the shedding of his blood we might have life. We might gain forgiveness. We might be reconciled to him. He did nothing for them in building for them a nation and giving them a territory and a kingdom compared to the building of the church. He did nothing for them in the upholding of the strength and the power of their armies in war compared to what our brethren do for us as they encourage us, uplift us, strengthen our hands when they get weak, lift up our weak knees, help bear our burdens, help us gain success in the burdens of this world. Consider what great things he has done for you. It means a whole lot more today talking to this audience than it meant when Samuel said it to his audience. He's done even greater things for us. If those things were enough to cause them to fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all their heart, then what he has done for us certainly should be enough to cause us to fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all of our heart. A failure to repent and a failure to return to God is catastrophic. I'll leave you with the 25th verse of 1 Samuel 12 that says, "But if you still do wickedly." What a sad statement. After all of that he's rehearsed here with him and all that he has reminded them about what God has done as God is doing for them, he says, "But if you still do wickedly, you shall be swept away, both you and your king." It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Not one of us will stand against the judgment of God. And not any earthly thing that we look to for hope and deliverance, which is what the king there represents, is going to protect us from that judgment. Let us learn from these things to live in these ways. And if we can help you in any way this evening, let it be known as we stand and sing.
Wonderful story of love, tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, with the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love.